Viktor Volkov pressed the barrel of his rifle against the kneeling CIA officer's temple and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a tactical bluff. A slow, deliberate laugh that told everyone watching through their scopes that he had already won. He looked directly into the drone feed he knew was watching and said in perfect English, "Send me your best. I will send them back in pieces." Then he chambered around. If you've never seen a man declare war on an entire nation with a single sentence, you haven't met Viktor Volkov, and you haven't met Claire Carter yet. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because what Claire does next will change everything you think you know about courage. Forward Operating Base Viper did not welcome Lieutenant Claire Carter. It tolerated her, and there is an enormous difference between those two things. The base sat in a brutal stretch of eastern Afghanistan, where the wind cut sideways and the dust never fully settled, where men moved with the particular kind of quiet authority that came from having already survived things most people could not imagine. Claire had driven through the gate in the back of a supply convoy, which was itself a statement. No escort, no ceremony, no one standing at the perimeter to acknowledge that a new operator had arrived. Just the gate, the dust, and the indifferent eyes of 2 sentries who looked at her. IDD looked at her face and said nothing worth repeating. She had a duffel bag on each shoulder and a rifle case in her right hand. The case was worn at the corners, the latches scratched from use, the kind of wear that didn't come from storage, but from field rotations. Claire noticed 2 men near the motor pool watching her walk across the compound. She did not look away from them. She kept her pace steady, her eyes forward, and she let them stare as long as they wanted. One of them said something she couldn't fully hear. The other one laughed. She kept walking. The operations building was a reinforced structure near the center of the base, and it was there that she received her unit assignment. Iron Wolf. The name meant something specific in the special operations community. It was not a designation handed to ordinary teams. Iron Wolf had a record that intelligence analysts spoke about in careful, measured language, because the full version of that record was still classified. Claire had read the unclassified summary 3 times on the flight in. She had memorized the key personnel. She had studied their operational patterns, their communication rhythms, their individual performance metrics as thoroughly as the redacted files allowed. She had done this not because she was anxious, but because preparation was the only honest form of confidence she had ever known. Master Chief Dominic Sullivan was the first Iron Wolf operator she encountered who acknowledged her directly. He was standing at the mission board when she entered, a large man with a face that had been rearranged by years and violence into something that no longer telegraphed emotion easily. He looked at her rifle case, looked back at her face. "You're Carter," he said. "Yes, Master Chief." "You were top of your class." "Yes, Master Chief." "Sniper qualification, surveillance, CQB secondary." "Correct." He studied her for another moment. "How many live deployments?" "This is my first combat rotation." Sullivan said nothing for 2 full seconds. Then he turned back to the mission board. "Commander Blake's been briefed. You'll get your assignment in the morning brief." "Understood." She expected him to leave it there. He didn't. Without turning around, he said, "Carter, this team has been in country for 14 months. Every operator on this team has buried someone they trained with. I'm not saying that to intimidate you. I'm saying it so you understand what kind of room you're walking into." Claire set her duffel bags down. "I understand, Master Chief." "Good." He still didn't turn around, because understanding it and being ready for it are 2 entirely different things. She was assigned a bunk in a separate section of the barracks, which was standard, and she arranged her gear with the systematic precision that had become so habitual, she did it without thinking. Equipment check, weapon inspection, ammunition count, environmental assessment. Her father had taught her the ritual when she was 11 years old, kneeling beside her in the garage of their house in rural Virginia, while he walked her through the maintenance of a bolt-action 308. He had been a patient teacher, and a precise one, a man who believed that attention to detail was not a personality trait, but a moral position. He had told her once that a person who is careless with a rifle is careless with a life, and that carelessness with a life is the one sin that cannot be walked back. She had never forgotten it. She never forgot anything he told her. He had died 2 years before she entered the program. She kept his photograph folded inside the cover of the small notebook she carried in her left breast pocket. She had not shown it to anyone. She would not. Morning brief arrived with the abrupt efficiency that characterized Iron Wolf's operational tempo. 8 operators gathered around a table covered with satellite imagery, terrain maps, and signals intelligence summaries. Claire took a position at the edge of the group. She did not push toward the center. She listened. Commander Nathan Blake ran the brief. He was not what she had expected. The file she'd read described him as decorated, effective, and unconventional in his mission planning, but files rarely captured the quality of a person's stillness. Blake was still in a way that felt deliberate, like a man who had decided a long time ago that excess motion was a form of dishonesty. He spoke with precision. He did not repeat himself. He moved through the operational details with the steady cadence of someone who had given many briefings and understood that clarity was more valuable than theater. The mission was designated Extraction Covenant. A CIA asset codenamed Shepard had been compromised inside the Arahim Valley. Shepard had been embedded for 17 months gathering intelligence on Russian-backed arms trafficking networks. His cover had broken 3 days ago. He was currently being held in a fortified compound 9 kilometers into the valley, surrounded by a hostile force estimated at 20 to 30 fighters, led by a former Russian special operations commander named Viktor Volkov. At the mention of Volkov's name, the room changed temperature. Claire noticed it immediately. Not panic, not fear, something more specific than either of those things. The particular alertness of men who had heard a name before and associated it with consequences. Sullivan crossed his arms. Corporal Raymond Hayes, who had been standing with the loose, slightly bored posture of someone enduring a briefing, he expected to contain no surprises, went very still. Blake continued. Volkov had commanded Russian special operations units in Syria and Ukraine before transitioning to private military work. He had engaged NATO-affiliated teams on 4 previous occasions. In 3 of those engagements, no NATO operators survived to give a full account of what happened. Intelligence was pieced together from drone footage and signals data. Volkov was disciplined, adaptive, and operated with the specific ruthlessness of a man who had concluded that restraint was a liability. Blake described the compound, the access routes, the anticipated defensive positions, the time window for extraction, which was narrow and dependent on a weather system moving through the valley that would degrade enemy air support capability and create a limited operational corridor. Then he said the name. Overwatch sniper for this extraction will be Lieutenant Carter. The silence that followed was of a very particular quality. It was not the silence of acceptance. It was the silence of men choosing in real time how to respond to something that surprised them. Claire watched their faces without appearing to watch their faces, a skill she had developed over years of operating in rooms where her presence was considered a statement before she had said a single word. Hayes looked at Sullivan. Sullivan looked at the table. One of the other operators, a man named Kowalski, whose file she remembered as a breacher with 2 purple hearts, exhaled in a way that was technically not a word, but communicated an entire paragraph. Blake said, Overwatch position is here. He indicated a point on the terrain map. 1,100 meters from the primary extraction point. Angle covers all 4 vehicle approaches and the main compound entrance. It is the controlling position for this operation. Hayes spoke. Commander, no offense to the lieutenant, but we're talking about 1,000-meter-plus position in wind conditions that are going to be unpredictable. That is not a position for someone on their first rotation. Blake looked at Hayes with an expression that contained no particular warmth. Your concern is noted, Corporal. Commander, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm trying to talk. Your concern is noted. Blake's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Are there other questions about the mission plan? There were not. After the brief ended and operators began moving to their respective preparation stations, Claire stayed at the table for a moment longer than necessary. She studied the terrain map. She calculated the elevation differential, the prevailing wind patterns based on the meteorological data, in the briefing package, the expected light conditions at insertion time. She did the math quietly in her head, checking it once and then again. Sullivan approached her when the room had mostly cleared. Carter. Master Chief? He stood beside her and looked at the map. Not at her, at the map. That's a hard position. I've done Overwatch from difficult setups. What you're looking at there is a different category of difficult. I know. Wind in that valley is unpredictable. The terrain channels it in directions that don't match the meteorological data. You can calculate all you want and still get surprised. I know, Master Chief. He finally looked at her. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm saying I want you to know that I know what I'm asking when I follow that order. Claire met his gaze. With respect, Master Chief, you're not asking. Commander Blake is asking, and my answer is yes. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not approval exactly, but a recalibration. Get your equipment ready, he said. We move at 2,300. She spent the rest of the day in preparation. She field-stripped her rifle and inspected every component with the methodical attention her father had modeled for her. She checked her ammunition, examining each round individually, something most snipers did in training and abandoned in field conditions. She did not abandon it. She read the meteorological reports 3 times and cross-referenced them against topographical data for the Al Rahim Valley, building a mental map of how wind would behave at altitude, at valley floor, at the specific angles her position would require her to compensate for. Hayes found her in the equipment bay during the afternoon. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. You know what the problem is with this setup? She didn't look up from her ammunition check. Which problem, specifically? Nobody on this team has worked with you. We don't know how you move. We don't know how you think under fire. We don't know if you're going to freeze or make a call that gets someone killed. That's accurate, Claire said. Hayes blinked. He had apparently expected either defensiveness or deference. He got neither. That's it. That's accurate. You don't know those things about me. I understand why that creates concern. She set down the rounds she was inspecting and looked at him directly. I also can't give you that information in a conversation. The only way you get it is the same way I earned every other qualification I have. You watch me work. And if what I see when I watch you work is someone who can't handle the pressure, then you'll have your answer, and it'll be a real answer instead of a guess. Hayes stared at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly like he was processing something uncomfortable. Then he walked away without responding. That, Claire thought, was probably as honest a conversation as she was going to get from him before the mission. The hours before insertion were quiet in the way that pre-mission hours always were, a quiet that had nothing to do with the absence of sound and everything to do with the compression of focus. Men became smaller versions of themselves in the best possible way, stripped down to function, to purpose, to the specific set of skills that had brought them to this particular moment in this particular place. Claire recognized the feeling intimately. It was one of the few contexts in which she had never felt out of place. She ate a meal she didn't taste. She hydrated on a schedule. She reviewed her firing solution calculations one final time, and then put them away because at some point preparation had to become trust in what preparation had built. She took the photograph of her father from her notebook and held it for 30 seconds. Then she folded it carefully and put it back. Blake found her 40 minutes before mission launch. He did something she did not expect. He sat down across from her in the equipment room and was quiet for a moment before speaking, which meant he had come to say something that required care. You know why I chose you for that position, he said. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. Because it's the most critical position in the mission, and you needed the best available asset for it. That's part of it. He leaned forward slightly. The other part is that I've read every performance report your training command produced. I've watched your qualification footage. I've looked at every shot record you have. Carter, your numbers aren't good for a first rotation sniper. They're not even good for an experienced sniper. They're historically unusual. She said nothing. But numbers aren't what I need out there. Blake's voice was steady. What I need is a person who can hold a position alone under fire with the entire weight of this mission sitting on every trigger pull and not come apart. That's not a thing you can measure with numbers. No, sir? So tell me, can you do it? Claire looked at him. She thought about her father. She thought about every training evaluation she had endured under the skeptical eye of instructors who had expected her to fail and adjusted their expectations grudgingly, incrementally, never fully, always with the particular reservation of people who cannot quite believe what they're seeing even while they're seeing it. She thought about what it felt like to lie still in a firing position for 8 hours and feel the world slow down around her until the only thing that existed was the distance between the barrel and the target and the breath moving through her body like a tide. "Yes, sir," she said. "I can do it." Blake studied her for another moment. Then he stood. "Equipment check in 30. Full kit. Don't be late." She wasn't late. The full Iron Wolf team assembled in the staging area with the efficient, unhurried motion of operators who had done this enough times that the ritual of it had become its own kind of calm. Claire moved through the final kit check, confirmed her communications were clean, verified her position on the team movement plan, and settled her rifle across her body with the particular ease of a person who has carried a specific weight so many times it has become an extension of their own. Sullivan walked past her during the final check and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Wind picks up after midnight in that valley. It comes from the northeast when it shifts. Don't let the initial readings make you comfortable." She nodded. "Thank you, Master Chief." He moved on without another word. Hayes stood at the far end of the staging area. He had not spoken to her again since the afternoon. He was checking his own equipment with the focused attention of a man choosing not to look at something he was thinking about. Claire watched him for a moment, then looked away. There was nothing to be resolved between them in this room. Whatever existed between them would be resolved in the field, or it would not be resolved at all. Blake stood at the center of the staging area and looked at his team with an expression that communicated everything that needed to be communicated without a single word. Then he said, "Iron Wolf, you know why we're here and you know what we're going to do. Bring Shepard home. Watch your sector. Trust your training." A pause. "Move out." The vehicles began to roll. Claire sat in the back of the lead vehicle with Sullivan and two other operators, her rifle across her knees, her eyes focused on nothing specific and everything general. The base fell away behind them. The valley waited ahead, invisible in the darkness, but present in everything, in the quality of the air, in the weight of what was coming, in the particular silence of men moving towards something they could not fully predict, but had chosen to face anyway. She thought about the 1,100 meters. She thought about Viktor Volkov. She thought about the CIA asset called Shepard, who was somewhere in that valley waiting in whatever kind of darkness captivity creates, holding on to whatever belief had kept him alive for the past 3 days. She thought about her father, who had told her once on a cold Virginia morning, with the rifle between them and the target at 300 meters, that the hardest part of any shot was not the mechanics, but the willingness. The willingness to be the person who does the thing that has to be done, regardless of whether anyone else believes you can. She was willing. The valley opened ahead of them like a held breath. She checked her rifle one final time and was ready. The vehicles stopped 2 kilometers from the valley entrance, and from that point, Iron Wolf moved on foot. Claire felt the shift the moment she stepped out, not in temperature, but in intention, the way the air pressed differently when you were moving towards something that could kill you. She adjusted the rifle across her back and fell into the movement pattern without being told where to position herself. She had memorized the team's tactical formation from the mission brief. She knew her place. Sullivan was on her left, 3 meters back. Hayes was forward on the right flank, moving with the efficient, almost mechanical stride of someone whose body had learned to conserve energy without being told to. The 2 other operators, Kowalski and a quiet man named Reyes, who had not spoken a single word to her at any point, moved with the same disciplined economy. Blake led from the front. He did not look back to check on her. She noted that. It was either confidence in her ability to keep pace or indifference to whether she did. She chose to read it as the former and move accordingly. The intelligence package had placed the compound 9 kilometers in. Claire's overwatch position was on a ridge that required her to separate from the main element at the 2-kilometer mark inside the valley, move independently up a lateral slope, and establish her position before the main team reached the compound perimeter. That gave her a separation window of approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes alone in darkness, moving up terrain that the topographical map showed as steep and irregular, carrying a rifle system that weighed with the full optics and suppressor assembly just over 14 pounds. She had done longer climbs with heavier loads. She reminded herself of this exactly once, and then stopped reminding herself of things because that kind of internal management was itself a distraction. At the separation point, Blake stopped and turned to face her. He said nothing. He simply held eye contact for 2 seconds, which was the operational equivalent of a full speech from most commanders she had served under. She gave him a single nod. He returned it. She peeled off from the element and moved toward the ridge. The first thing she noticed when she was alone was how completely and utterly alone she was. Not in the emotional sense, in the tactical sense. No radio chatter to track the team's movement. No peripheral awareness of other bodies creating sound and motion that told your nervous system the team was intact. Just her, the slope, the darkness, and the weight of the rifle. She climbed. The terrain was worse than the maps had suggested, which was almost always true of terrain in the Al Rahim Valley according to the operational notes she had read. The eastern slope shifted between loose shale and compacted dirt in a pattern that made footing unpredictable. 3 times she placed a foot and felt the surface given a direction she hadn't anticipated. Each time she corrected without slowing, without grabbing for a handhold, without making the kind of noise that would carry in the still night air before the wind came up. Sullivan's warning lived in the back of her mind. Wind picks up after midnight in that valley. It comes from the northeast when it shifts. She checked her watch. 11:47, 13 minutes. She moved faster. The ridge was not a clean, elevated platform. It was a fractured surface of broken rock, with multiple low points and angles, none of which matched the simplified representation in the satellite imagery with complete accuracy. Claire worked through it quickly, assessing each position against her mental model of the compound's location and the angles she needed to cover. She settled finally on a position behind a natural rock formation that gave her a prone support surface and a clear sight line down into the valley floor below the compound's main approach. She got into position, extended her bipod, and settled the rifle. Range check to the compound gate 1,140 meters. She verified the figure against her pre-calculated firing solution and made the adjustments. Elevation, wind hold, which was still theoretical because the wind had not yet shifted. She dialed in the turrets with the small, precise movements her father had spent years drilling into her until they required no conscious thought. Then the wind shifted. It came from the northeast exactly as Sullivan had said, and it came with a force that the meteorological data had not fully captured. Not a catastrophic shift. Not the kind of thing that would have surprised a careless sniper into a miss, but enough that her established hold was now 2.5 minutes of angle, insufficient for the true condition. She made the adjustment. Then she made it again when the wind changed direction, slightly testing, probing the way wind did in channeled terrain. She settled. She waited. The radio crackled softly in her earpiece. Blake's voice compressed and quiet. Iron Wolf radio check. All elements sound off. One by one, the team confirmed position. Sullivan, Hayes, Kowalski, Reyes. Then Blake himself on a different frequency to higher command. Iron Wolf sniper position confirmed, Blake said. Iron Wolf sniper, position set, Overwatch is live. A pause, then Sullivan's voice not on the command channel but on the team channel, quieter. Good position, Carter. She said nothing. She was already somewhere else in her mind in the particular focused state that Overwatch demanded, where the world narrowed to the diameter of her scope and everything outside it became secondary information. Down in the valley, Iron Wolf moved toward the compound. She tracked them in her scope, not on a firing solution, but on a monitoring track, watching their approach angles, noting their spacing, cataloging the environmental conditions around the compound perimeter. 2 sentries were visible at the main gate, one on the roofline of the primary structure, one in a vehicle at the north approach that her angle could cover cleanly. 4 visible. Intelligence had estimated 20 to 30 total. The math of that gap lived uncomfortably at the edge of her awareness. Blake's element reached the 200-meter mark from the compound perimeter. They went static, waiting for the signal window that would tell them the internal extraction contact had disabled the compound's communication system for the 60-second window they needed to move. Claire held her breath and then released it. Held it again. Released it. The sentries at the gate were rotating. She tracked the rotation timing. 14 seconds between full turns. That was the movement window Blake would use to get his element to the wall. Then something changed. The sentry on the roofline stopped moving. Just stopped. Became completely still in a way that was different from the loose bored stillness of a man running a routine post. This was the stillness of alertness, of something heard or seen that didn't fit. Claire felt the shift before she understood it. She moved her scope to the vehicle at the north approach. The driver, who had been slumped in a posture that suggested boredom, was now sitting upright. The vehicle's engine, which she had been tracking by the faint heat distortion visible in her scope, was running. "Iron Wolf Actual," she said, keeping her voice flat. "Rooftop sentry has gone alert. North vehicle is running." 2 seconds of silence. Then Blake. "Say again, sniper." Rooftop sentry changed posture to alert status. North vehicle engine is active. Something has changed inside that compound. Blake's voice 1 degree tighter than it had been. "Team hold position." Silence. And then the compound's exterior lights came on. Not all at once, in sequence. From the north corner first, then sweeping around the perimeter in a pattern that was unmistakably deliberate, a coordinated activation that someone inside had triggered on a signal. And in the sudden harsh illumination of those lights, Claire saw what had been invisible in the darkness. There were not 4 sentries outside the compound. There were 11. The others had been positioned in the shadows at angles that the intelligence assessment had not accounted for, placed with the specific precision of a man who understood how surveillance assets would be positioned and had deliberately chosen positions outside those coverage zones. "Iron Wolf Actual." Her voice was completely level. "Compound is lit. I'm counting 11 external sentries." "Repeat 11 external. This is a prepared position. Volkov knows we're coming." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Hayes on the team channel, in a voice that contained more information in its tone than in its words. "Oh, hell," Blake said. "All elements execute contingency. Now." What happened next happened very fast. The compound's main gate opened, and a technical vehicle, a pickup with a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, rolled out and accelerated in the direction of Blake's element. At the same time, from a position 200 meters to the west that had not appeared in any of the intelligence imagery, a second vehicle emerged and began moving to cut off the team's withdrawal route. And from the roofline of the compound, 3 men with RPGs stood up. The trap had not just been set, it had been timed. "Iron Wolf Sniper," Blake said, and his voice was the calmest thing in the entire valley at that moment. "Engage the RPG positions. Now." Claire was already on the first one. The wind was coming from the northeast at 11 miles per hour with a gusting variance she had been tracking for the past 20 minutes. Her elevation was dialed. Her position was stable. The first RPG operator was at 1,160 meters, slightly farther than her calculated primary position, but within her verified effective range. She exhaled half a breath and held it. She pressed the trigger. The rifle moved. The sound went into the suppressor and came out as something that was still a report, but a reduced one. Downrange, the first RPG operator dropped. She was already cycling the bolt. Second target. The movement of acquiring the second man took less than 2 seconds. He had started to turn toward where the first shot had come from, which was an instinct that was going to cost him, because turning meant presenting his chest instead of his side. She fired. He went down. The third man did something disciplined and dangerous. He dropped flat and rolled behind the roofline parapet instead of running or freezing. "Smart." She lost the angle. "2 RPG positions neutralize," she said into the radio. "Third has gone to cover. Tracking." "Machine gun technical, north approach," Blake said. "Can you take the vehicle?" "Angle is narrow. Give me a second." She shifted her position 6 inches to the right, which was the maximum she could move, without compromising her concealment. The angle to the technical's vehicle opened by just enough. The fuel tank was behind the rear wheel well on the driver's side. She fired twice. The vehicle's rear end lifted, and the sound arrived at her position 3 seconds after the event. A deep concussive report that she felt in her sternum before she heard it clearly. From the team channel, Kowalski's voice. "Vehicle is down. North approach is clear." "Second vehicle is still moving," Reyes said. "It's cutting the withdrawal route." Claire was already moving her scope. The second vehicle was farther angled, badly moving fast. She tracked it. At 1,310 meters, moving at what she estimated as 40 kilometers per hour on a lateral track, she was looking at the most difficult shot she had ever been asked to take in live conditions. In training, she had taken moving targets at 1,100 meters. The additional 210 meters under these wind conditions, at this angle, changed the mathematics of the shot substantially. She heard Hayes on the team channel. "Sniper, if that vehicle closes the withdrawal route, we are going to have a problem." She did not respond. She was in the place where words did not exist. Just distance, motion, wind, and the geometry of interception. She calculated the lead. She adjusted for the wind variance that had been running at a slightly higher rate in the past 3 minutes. She factored the downhill angle. She fired. The vehicle swerved hard. The driver had been hit or panicked at the sound of the round impacting the engine compartment. The vehicle went sideways and stopped moving. Reyes said, "Withdrawal route is clear." Blake said, "Iron Wolf pushed to the compound. We have a window. Move." The next 4 minutes were the most demanding of her life to that point. Not the most dangerous, though they were that too, but the most demanding in the pure cognitive sense. Iron Wolf was pushing into the compound while remaining enemy fighters in the valley and on the perimeter were responding, repositioning, finding angles. Every time she acquired a position that threatened the team's movement, she was making calculations in fractions of seconds under conditions that were changing constantly. She dropped a man moving to flank the team's left element. She redirected fire from a prepared position to the northeast that had been concealed until the main element was inside the compound perimeter. She tracked the third RPG operator who had come back up from cover and was relocating along the roofline toward a better angle. She found him at the corner of the parapet and fired before he reached his new position. Sullivan's voice. "Sniper, we have contact inside the compound. Multiple fighters. We're moving toward Shepard's position now." "Copy. I have your perimeter. Move." Hayes came on the channel. "Carter, there's a vehicle moving from the southeast. Headlights off. It's moving slow and it's heavy. Something is wrong with that vehicle." She found it in her scope. He was right, it was heavy. It was moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of something that did not need to move quickly because it was protected. And as she watched it turn at the compound's southeast corner and angle toward the team's extraction point, she saw what the headlights would have illuminated if they had been on. It was an armored personnel carrier, not standard, modified. The thermal profile through her scope showed it was equipped with external sensor packages she recognized from intelligence briefings on Russian tactical vehicle upgrades. Thermal imaging, active sensors, designed specifically to make conventional sniper concealment ineffective. She stared at it for a moment that felt very long. She could not stop that vehicle from her current position with her current ammunition. The angles were wrong and the armor was wrong, and the ammunition she carried was designed for human targets, not for penetrating the plating she was looking at. Blake said on the command channel, his voice carrying the first edge she had heard from him. "Sniper, I need that vehicle stopped. Shepard is being moved to extraction. If that APC reaches the extraction point before we do, we lose him and we lose operators. Talk to me." She stared at the APC. She said, "Commander, I need to change position." A pause. "Explain." "From my current position, I cannot engage that vehicle with effect. There is a secondary position 200 meters north along this ridge that gives me a direct angle on the sensor array at the front of the vehicle. If I can destroy the sensors, the vehicle goes effectively blind. It will stop or slow to avoid running into friendly positions. But I have to move to get that angle." "How long?" 4 minutes. Another pause. She could hear distantly through the radio the sounds of the team fighting inside the compound. "Carter." Blake's voice was different now. Not the commander voice, something more direct. "If you move and they reacquire your position while you're exposed on that ridge, there is no extraction for you. You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes, sir." "Say it back to me." "If I'm compromised during the move, the team extracts without me." The pause this time was 3 seconds. Blake said, "Your call, I won't order it." Claire looked at the APC. She looked at the position on the ridge she had mapped in her mind when she first established Overwatch, the one she had filed away as a contingency option without knowing what contingency it would serve. She thought of Shepard somewhere in that compound being moved toward an exit point that was about to be occupied by an armored vehicle with thermal sensors and a gun. She thought of Sullivan and Hayes and Kowalski and Reyes. She picked up her rifle and started moving. The ridge at a run in the dark on loose terrain with a 14-pound rifle was not the same as the ridge at a careful climb in an insertion scenario. She moved with controlled urgency, keeping her footfalls as quiet as possible while covering ground as fast as the surface allowed. Twice she went to one knee as the shale shifted and caught herself before going fully down. She did not slow down after either stumble. She adjusted her balance and kept moving. 200 meters on that terrain took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She found the secondary position, a lower but more exposed outcropping, that gave her the angle Blake had needed her to have, and she dropped into prone without ceremony. Positioned the rifle, found the APC in her scope. The sensor array at the front of the vehicle was a cluster of 4 units mounted above the front armor plate, military grade. She estimated the housing was armored to a modest level enough to survive small arms fire, but not purpose-designed to stop a precision rifle round at this range. She was at 960 meters, much closer than her overwatch position. The wind was the same, the shot was cleaner. She put 2 rounds through the sensor cluster in under 3 seconds. The AP stopped. Not immediately. It coasted for another 30 meters while the driver inside processed what had happened to his sensors. Then it stopped and it stayed. Stopped because a vehicle designed to use thermal and active sensors to navigate in darkness is effectively blind without those systems, and a disciplined driver knows not to move forward blind into a combat zone. Haze on the radio. The APC just stopped. What happened to it? Blake said, sniper, status. Vehicle is sensor blind. It'll hold position until the crew can establish visual contact and assess the situation. You have a window. Use it. Sullivan said, Shepard is secured. We are moving to extraction. Iron Wolf on me. And then from a position she had not accounted for because it had not been in any intelligence assessment, and it had not been visible from her overwatch position, and it had not been detectable until this moment when she was lying exposed on an outcropping 200 meters from where she had been. A set of hands closed around her rifle barrel from behind. She had been so completely focused on the APC that she had not heard them come up the slope behind her. There were 3 of them, and one of them was not a rank-and-file fighter. He was tall, wearing no insignia, but carrying himself with the particular authority of a man accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. He looked down at her with an expression that was almost curious, the way a person looks at something unexpected, that they are nevertheless not surprised to encounter because they had planned for exactly this. Viktor Volkov said in English that was precise and unaccented, Iron Wolf sniper. He tilted his head slightly. I was wondering when I would see you. She held completely still, and in that stillness, she began to think. Volkov did not grab her immediately. That was the first thing she registered, and it told her something critical about him. A man who rushes to physically control a disarmed opponent is a man operating on instinct. A man who stands still and looks at you is a man who is confident he already has control, which means he believes the situation is already resolved in his favor. That kind of confidence was dangerous. It was also, if she was patient enough, a vulnerability. The 2 fighters flanking him had their weapons raised. One was positioned to her left at roughly 2 meters, the other directly behind her at a distance she estimated as 4 meters based on the sound of his breathing and the weight of his footstep when he had shifted position a moment ago. The rifle had been pulled from her hands and was now out of reach. Her sidearm was on her right hip under her jacket, accessible if her hands were free, which they were not going to be for long. Volkov crouched to her level. He was unhurried about it the way a man is unhurried when he has nowhere urgent to be. You took my sensors, he said. That was a good shot. Both rounds through the cluster at this range in this wind. He paused. Your file says you are a first rotation operator. That is either a lie or something more interesting. She said nothing. The team is extracting now, he continued. Shepard is with them. I knew they would get through once the compound security was degraded. I planned for that. He held eye contact with her. I also planned for the person on Overwatch, the one who made all the other shots possible, the one who would have to move to stop the APC. She felt something cold move through her chest that she refused to let reach her face. This position, he gestured at the outcropping. It is the only angle on the sensor array that works from this ridge. I have been here before. I walked this terrain 3 days ago. I knew someone good enough to stop the APC would come here. He stood back up. I only needed to wait. She had been walked into it. The APC had not been a last-minute threat. It had been a mechanism to move her from a protected overwatch position to an exposed secondary position that Volkov had selected for her. Everything she had done in the last 4 minutes had been exactly what he needed her to do. The team was extracting. Shepard was out. She had accomplished what the mission required. She held on to that. The fighter on her left moved forward and secured her wrist with a flex cuff pulling tight enough to be immediately painful. She did not react to the pain. She cataloged it instead, noted it, assessed whether the tightness was tight enough to affect blood flow and circulation in a way that would impair her hands if she needed them later. It was. She began working her wrist against the cuff with a motion so small it was invisible, not to break free, but to create the minimal slack that would matter later. Volkov watched her do it. His expression suggested he knew exactly what she was doing and was not concerned. "The ankle blade," he said. One of the fighters reached down and found it. She had carried a secondary blade in an ankle sheath for exactly the contingency she had just lost. The fighter removed it and stepped back. Volkov said, "What is your name?" She said nothing. He accepted that with a small nod. "It doesn't matter. You are the Iron Wolf sniper. That is enough." He gestured to his men, and the two of them moved her off the ridge and down the slope toward a vehicle she could hear idling at the base of the eastern approach. On the team channel, which was still active in her earpiece, she heard Blake's voice. "Iron Wolf sniper status check. Report position." She said nothing. Any response would confirm her capture and potentially give Volkov's team information about the extraction timeline and route. Sullivan's voice. "Carter, talk to us." Still nothing. A pause, then Hayes in his voice had something in it she had not heard from him before. "Sniper is not responding. She was on the North Ridge. We need to go back." Blake. "Negative. Shepard is our primary. We hold extraction." Hayes again, and the something in his voice was sharper now. "Commander, she stopped the APC. If she hadn't moved to that position, we would be pinned right now. We can't just—" "Hayes." Blake's voice was quiet and absolute. "Hold extraction. That is an order." Silence on the channel. Claire was put in the back of a vehicle, not a military transport, a civilian truck modified with a cargo cage in the bed, the kind of anonymous vehicle that moved through rural Afghanistan without attracting the particular attention that military equipment drew. She noted the modification. She noted the way the cage was constructed, welded steel rebar on a frame, the welds inconsistent in quality, some clean and some rushed. She filed it. She also noted with a particular awareness that adrenaline had sharpened to something close to perfect clarity that Volkov rode in the cab in the front and his two fighters rode in the cargo bed with her, which meant the decision to position himself away from the prisoner was itself a statement. He was not afraid of her. He was not treating her as a threat to be closely managed. He was treating her as a resource to be transported. That told her something about what came next. A man who is afraid of a prisoner keeps them close and keeps them controlled. A man who views a prisoner as a resource thinks about the resource's utility. Volkov thought she had information he wanted. That gave her a window because a man who wants information does not immediately destroy the person who has it. She had time. The drive lasted what she estimated as 35 minutes on a route that involved 3 turns and at least one significant elevation change based on the angle of the truck bed and the engine's sound underload. She memorized the sequence of turns and the elapsed time between them. She noted the surface changes she could feel through the truck's suspension. She built a map in her mind of a route she could not see. They arrived at a structure she could identify only by the sounds and smells that penetrated the cargo cage. Stone walls, a courtyard of packed earth, the particular dry smell of a structure that had been abandoned and recently reoccupied, dust and diesel and old smoke. The two fighters moved her inside. Volkov was already there when she was brought into the main room. He had moved faster than the truck, which meant he had taken a different vehicle, which meant he had come ahead to prepare. She cataloged that too. The room had a support column in the center, her thick stone, and she was secured to it with her wrists bound behind the column rather than in front of her body. That was a significant change. With her wrist behind a column, she could not access the flex cuffs with her hands or her teeth, and her mobility was reduced to essentially nothing. Whatever minimal slack she had been working into the cuffs during transport was still there, but it was now considerably less useful. She checked the column with the back of her hands as subtly as she could. Solid. It was structural, not decorative. Attempting to work through it physically was not an option. Volkov sat across from her. He had water, and he drank some of it and did not offer her any. Not a cruelty, a calculation. Thirst is a tool. I will tell you what I want, he said, and I will tell you exactly what I will do to get it. I have found that honesty at this stage saves everyone a great deal of time and pain. Not all of the pain, just most of it. She looked at him steadily. Your team's extraction route, he said, the Chinook landing zone, the timeline for the next window, and the backup communication frequency your command uses when primary goes down. The extraction route and landing zone were the critical pieces. If Volkov had those, he could position forces to intercept the team and Shepard before they reached safety. Everything she had accomplished, every shot, every calculation, every choice she had made on that ridge would be undone. She said, I'm not going to give you those things. Volkov looked at her for a moment. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, slightly disappointed. I know, he said, but you will eventually. Everyone does. The body is not as disciplined as the mind. The mind says hold, but the body has its own vote, and eventually the body wins. He nodded to one of his fighters. What followed was methodical and deliberate, and she was not going to describe it to herself while it was happening, because description was a form of distance, and she needed not distance, but presence. She needed to stay inside her own mind and remain the person she was, because the moment she stopped being that person was the moment she became someone who could be broken. She thought about her father. She thought about the garage in Virginia and the rifle between them in the cold morning air, and his voice saying that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to stop when fear had already won. She did not think about the pain. She thought about her father's voice and held it like a fixed point in a spinning room. Volkov watched the process with the detached attention of a professional. After some time had passed, he came forward again and crouched in front of her in the same way he had crouched on the ridge, the gesture that said he was not in a hurry. The extraction route, he said, landing zone, timeline, frequency. She looked at him. Her breathing was controlled, which surprised her a little. She had been afraid that control would go first. It hadn't. No, she said. Her voice was level. He studied her. You are more prepared for this than most. My father taught me what I needed to know. Something shifted in his expression, not softness, more like recognition. A soldier, a marksman. Volkov was quiet for a moment. My father was military also, Soviet air defense. He taught me that the most dangerous person in any conflict is not the one who is the most skilled. It is the one who has decided that there is something worth more to them than their own survival. He paused. I am looking at that person right now. She said nothing. He stood. We will continue in a few hours. I recommend you use the time to reconsider. He left. The two fighters remained in the room, positioned at the doorway. She began to assess her situation with the systematic attention she gave to every problem, starting with what she had and what she did not have. She had the minimal slack in her wrist restraints that she had worked in during transport, reduced in utility, but not eliminated. She did not have the ankle blade. She did not have her sidearm, which had been taken. She did not have her radio, which had also been taken. What she had that had not been taken was a thing Volkov had not thought to look for because it was too small and too ordinary to register as a threat. In the breast pocket of her jacket inside the notebook that still sat there, because it looked like a personal item and not a tactical one, was a folded photograph. And tucked inside the fold of that photograph, in the crease between the image and the backing, was a ceramic razor fragment, approximately 4 centimeters long, that she had carried as a last resort cutting tool since her second week in training, a habit her father had insisted on before any of her instructors thought to formalize it as doctrine. It was not a weapon. It was not much of a cutting tool. It was a 4-centimeter piece of ceramic that would take a significant amount of time and effort to work through a flex cuff and would require her to contort her wrists in ways that were going to be extremely painful in her current condition. But it was something. She began working her fingers toward her breast pocket. On the radio channel, which had gone silent after Blake's extraction order, a transmission came through in a burst format she recognized as an encoded short message package from higher command. She couldn't receive it. Her radio was gone. But the fact that it had come through on the frequency that was still live in the dead earpiece that Volkov's men had overlooked because it was wireless and small and had fallen partially behind her collar when they removed her radio told her something. The earpiece was still there. She could not transmit. She might be able to receive. She held still and listened. The burst transmission resolved after a moment of static into a voice she recognized as a JSOC operations coordinator at a level above Blake's command. It was a fragment. Most of it was lost in the encoding. But one sequence came through clearly enough. Iron Wolf element. Sniper asset designated as captured, not KYA. Intelligence assessment indicates she is being held at a secondary site in the Eastern Approach Corridor. Extraction window for primary mission closes in 40 minutes. Authorization for secondary recovery is pending command approval. Stand by. Captured, not KYA. Someone had tracked her. Drone signals intelligence, something had established she was alive and not dead on the ridge. That information had reached JSOC. Authorization for secondary recovery is pending. Pending was not denied. Pending meant someone upstairs was making a decision. She needed to be findable when that decision came through. She needed to not be deep inside a stone structure that thermal imaging could not penetrate. She needed to move. Her fingers reached the breast pocket. The two fighters at the door were not in direct visual contact with her wrists, which were behind the column. They could see her face and her body, but not her hands. She had verified this by testing very slightly the range of motion available to her and watching their eyes. Neither had reacted to the motion of her hands. She found the photograph. She worked it toward the pocket opening with her fingertips millimeter by millimeter, a process that required patience so absolute it was almost meditative. She thought of firing solutions, of the moment before the trigger breaks, when the whole world narrows to a single point and everything else falls away. This was that moment, extended and slow and conducted entirely through the tips of her fingers behind a stone column. The photograph reached the pocket opening. She worked the ceramic fragment free from the fold. She got it between her fingers. She began. The flex cuff material was not steel. It was hardened polymer, and hardened polymer applied correctly by a sharp edge under consistent pressure would eventually give way. The word eventually was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. She estimated the time required as somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes, depending on the angle she could maintain and the consistency of pressure she could apply, both of which were constrained by her position and by the pain that flared every time she rotated her wrist past a certain point. She applied consistent pressure, and she breathed, and she thought about her father, and she did not think about the time. 12 minutes into the process, one of the fighters left the room. She did not know why, and she did not look toward the door to check. She kept her eyes forward, her expression neutral, her hands moving in the same patient rhythm behind the column. 8 minutes after that, the remaining fighter's radio produced a burst of communication in Russian that she could not fully translate but parsed enough of to understand the meaning. Something had happened outside. Something that required attention. The fighter looked at her. He made the calculation that most guards make, the calculation that a bound prisoner attached to a stone column does not represent an immediate risk that justifies leaving a post undefended. He was wrong, but she did not give him any information that would correct his assessment. He left. She worked faster. 3 minutes later, the cuff gave way. She moved with the complete deliberateness of someone who knew that speed without direction was just chaos, and chaos got people killed. She took the photograph from the pocket first and held it for 1 second, not looking at it, but knowing it was in her hand. And then she replaced it carefully because even now, even here, there were things worth protecting. She assessed the room. One exit she had confirmed, possibly more based on the structure's size. She moved to the doorway and listened for 4 full seconds. Voices outside and to the left. 2 of them. Moving away, she went right. The structure had a secondary access point she found by following the airflow, a narrow passage behind a collapsed interior wall that opened to the exterior on the northern side. She moved through it without sound and came out into the cold night air in a posture low enough that she was below the sight line of anyone more than 10 meters away. She had no weapon, she had no radio. She had a ceramic fragment, a photograph, and a dead earpiece. She also had the map she had built in her mind during the 35-minute drive. 3 turns, elevation change, estimated distances between each based on travel time and speed. She had a direction and a distance and the absolute certainty that she was not going to stop moving until she was back in range of her team or her team was back in range of her. She ran. The terrain was dark and the footing was uncertain, and she ran anyway because in this moment speed was more valuable than silence, and she had made the calculation without hesitating. Her body said stop. Her body had a very long list of reasons why stopping was the correct biological response to recent events. She told her body in the language her father had taught her that had no words but was entirely understood that they were not stopping. She ran. 2 kilometers out, she heard helicopters, not one. Two. One was the Chinook she had expected, the extraction bird. The second was lighter, faster, lower, and it was not moving toward the primary extraction point. It was moving along the eastern approach corridor. She came over a rise and into a clearing that was 30 meters across, and she did not stop to think about whether it was the right move. She pulled the ceramic fragment from her pocket and used it to score 3 lines in the dirt in a pattern she knew JSOC drone operators were trained to recognize as a personnel recovery signal. Then she stood in the center of the clearing and looked up. The helicopter search beam came on. It found her in 11 seconds. She stood completely still in the beam of light, and she raised both hands above her head, the standard non-combatant signal, and she held that position while the helicopter descended toward her and the rotor wash hit her like a physical weight, and she simply refused to move until the skid touched the earth. Hayes was on that helicopter. He came off the skid before it fully landed, moving toward her in a low run, and when he reached her, he stopped and looked at her with an expression she had never expected to see on Raymond Hayes' face. "You're alive," he said. "I told you," she said. "Watch me work." Hayes stared at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then something broke open in his face. Not tears exactly, but the kind of expression that happens when a person has been holding something rigid for a very long time, and suddenly the reason to hold it rigid is gone. "Can you move?" he said. "I've been moving for the last 2 kilometers. Get me on that aircraft." He did. The helicopter lifted. She looked out the open door at the eastern quarter, falling away below at the dark terrain that had held her for the past several hours, at the structure she had escaped from, now visible as a small, pale shape against the mountain. She thought about Volkov in there somewhere, discovering the empty room and what his expression would look like at that moment. She thought it would look like the beginning of something unfinished. She was right. But she was also on a helicopter going home. For now, that was enough. The helicopter landed at FOB Viper at 0412, and Claire walked off the skid under her own power. That was the first thing she decided in the moment before the door gunner offered her a hand, that she was walking off this aircraft the same way she had walked into this base 18 hours ago. On her own feet, without assistance, without the particular expression of someone who needed to be helped. She walked off. The flight surgeon met her at the landing pad, a compact woman named Carver, who moved with the efficient practicality of someone who had seen enough field returns to know that the people most likely to argue about medical attention were the people who needed it most. She looked at Claire with the flat professional assessment of a person reading damage rather than responding to it. "Walk with me," Carver said, "not a question." "I'm walking." "To the medical bay." After debriefing, Carver matched her stride without missing a beat. "Debriefing can wait 40 minutes. Your radius might be cracked and I need an image before we find out the hard way." She paused. "Also, your left eye is tracking 3 degrees off. You have a concussion." Claire processed this. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm surprised you ran 2 kilometers in the dark without falling off a cliff." "I fell twice," Claire said. "Caught myself both times." Carver looked at her with something that was not quite respect and not quite horror, but contained elements of both. "Medical bay, 40 minutes. Then they can have you." She went to the medical bay. She sat on the examination table with the particular stillness of someone who has decided that the most efficient way to get through a required process is to stop fighting it. Carver worked efficiently and without unnecessary conversation, which Claire appreciated. The radius was not cracked. The concussion was real and would require monitoring. 3 ribs were bruised but intact. The wrist lacerations from the flex cuff were cleaned and dressed. Everything else Carver noted in the clipped, unemotional language of medical documentation. At one point, she said without looking up from what she was doing, "You didn't break." It wasn't a medical observation. Claire looked at her. "No. Some people do?" Carver finished the dressing. "Not a character judgment. Body chemistry training, a dozen variables. But some people do." She stepped back. "You didn't. That's going in my report." "Does your report matter?" It goes to psych assessment, which goes to the commander, which affects whether you go back out. Carver pulled off her gloves. So yes, it matters. Claire got off the table. Then thank you. Don't thank me yet. The debrief is going to be worse than the medical. She was not wrong. The debrief was conducted in the operations center by Blake and a CIA officer named Dorian, who had arrived on a separate aircraft sometime during the operation and whose presence at FOB Viper had not been announced to the team in advance. Dorian was a careful man in his 50s who wore civilian clothes and carried himself with the particular kind of authority that comes not from physical presence, but from the certainty of access. The manner of a person who is accustomed to operating at a level where information determines outcomes, and he has always been the person who controls the information. Sullivan was in the room. Hayes was not. Blake had positioned himself at the end of the table with Dorian to his left, and there were two additional personnel. Claire didn't recognize one in uniform and one not. She sat down. Blake said, "Before we begin, Extraction Covenant achieved its primary objective. Shepard is secure and already out of theater. That is because of what this team did tonight. That is on the record first." Dorian looked at her with the assessing patient look of someone reading a document they intend to find discrepancies in. "Lieutenant Carter, walk me through from the point of capture." She walked him through it. She kept her language precise and sequential. Capture on the North Ridge. Vehicle transport estimated 35 minutes, 3 turns, significant elevation change. Arrival at secondary structure. The room, the column, Volkov's questions, her refusal, the escape timeline. Dorian stopped her at the escape. "The ceramic fragment," he said. "Where did you carry it?" "Breast pocket, inside a personal item." "The notebook?" "Yes." "Why wasn't it found during the search?" "It was inside a folded photograph. The search was thorough for weapons and electronic equipment. The photograph registered as a personal item without tactical application." Dorian was quiet for a moment. "Volkov searched you personally?" "His fighters searched me," he observed. "And he asked specifically about the extraction route, landing zone, extraction window, backup frequency." "Yes." "He asked for 4 specific pieces of information. Not a general extraction inquiry, 4 specific pieces." Dorian leaned forward slightly. "Lieutenant, that level of operational specificity about an Iron Wolf extraction implies he had advanced knowledge of our mission structure. Not our route, not our timeline, but our framework. He knew what questions to ask." The room temperature dropped by several degrees without the actual temperature changing at all. Blake said carefully, "Dorian." "Commander Blake." Dorian did not look away from Claire. "The intelligence failure that led to the ambush tonight was not a general security breach. The compound was prepared specifically for Iron Wolf's approach pattern. Volkov positioned his secondary force on the North Ridge because he knew that was where an Overwatch sniper would have to move to engage the APC. He knew an Overwatch sniper would be used. He knew the APC would draw them out." He paused. "He knew the mission structure before we executed it." Sullivan moved, not dramatically, just a slight forward lean that was the physical equivalent of a person changing their mind about sitting still. "You're saying we have a leak." "I'm saying the specificity of Volkov's preparation strongly suggests advanced knowledge of operational parameters that were classified at a level that limits the pool of possible sources significantly." Blake said, "How significantly?" Dorian finally looked away from Claire. He looked at Blake with the expression of a man delivering something he has been carrying for longer than this conversation. "The mission parameters for Extraction Covenant were held by 6 people above field level. Mission planners, intelligence liaisons, 1 command authorization. We have been running a parallel signals intelligence assessment since the ambush was confirmed. We have preliminary results." He opened a folder on the table. Claire watched Blake's face as he read whatever was in that folder. She had become, over the past several months of working in close proximity to people under pressure, skilled at reading faces as tactical information. Blake's face was controlled. It was the face of a person who is controlling what their face does, which was itself a form of information. Something in that folder had hit him. Blake set the folder down. He looked at Sullivan. Sullivan looked back at him with the patient, watchful expression of a man waiting for a thing he already suspects. "The preliminary signals assessment," Blake said, his voice completely level. identifies a contact pattern between a source inside our command structure and an external communications node that traces to Volkov's operational network. The contact pattern began approximately 3 weeks ago. He stopped. Sullivan said, "Who?" Blake said a name. The name was not one Claire had heard before. It was a logistics coordination officer attached to JSOC's theater command, a man named Preller, who processed operational parameters for authorization and had access to mission frameworks across multiple active Iron Wolf operations. Not a field operator, not someone she had met, someone who existed in the administrative layer that field teams depended on and rarely thought about. Sullivan's jaw moved once. Then he was still. "Where is he now?" Sullivan said. "In custody as of 3 hours ago," Dorian said. The arrest was timed to coincide with mission completion to avoid any chance of him alerting Volkov's network before Shepard was clear. He folded his hands on the table. He gave us the exfil timing for tonight's operation. He gave Volkov the Overwatch Doctrine and the APC contingency protocol. He is why the North Ridge was covered. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. It was the silence of men processing a betrayal. Not abstract betrayal, the kind that exists in briefings and threat assessments. The specific personal kind. The kind that means someone who ate in the same dining facility, who walked the same corridors, who processed the same mission paperwork, had been working to kill them. Claire thought about the North Ridge. About Volkov saying, "I walked this terrain 3 days ago." About how completely she had been walked into exactly the position he needed her to be in. Preller had given Volkov the chessboard, and Volkov had known which piece would move where, and she had moved exactly where he expected. She had been played not by Volkov's tactical brilliance alone, but by the information advantage that betrayal had created. She sat with that for a moment. She let it be what it was. She did not minimize it. Then she said, "Volkov is still operational." Dorian looked at her. "Yes. Preller's arrest removes his intelligence access, but Volkov is still in theater with his network intact." "Also yes." "Then the problem isn't solved," Blake said. Carter. "Commander, with respect, Shepard is out, the leak is identified and contained. Those are the mission objectives for tonight, and they are achieved. But Viktor Volkov walked away from this operation with his people, his equipment, and his organizational structure intact. He will build new intelligence access. He will plan another operation against NATO assets, or CIA assets, or someone else's people. What happened on that ridge tonight will happen again to someone else somewhere else, unless he is stopped." The room was quiet. Blake looked at her for a long moment, not the way he had looked at her during the initial mission brief, not with the careful assessment of a commander evaluating an unknown asset, with something different, something more direct. "That," he said, "is a separate conversation." "Then I want to have it." Dorian said, "Lieutenant, you have a concussion and 3 bruised ribs, and you escaped capture 6 hours ago. The separate conversation can wait 24 hours. "It can wait," she agreed. "I'm putting it on the record that I want to have it." Dorian studied her. He made a note. Whether the note was literal or figurative, she could not tell, but something in his manner shifted. The document reading expression became something more like the expression of a person who has found an unexpected asset and is quietly updating their assessment of how to use it. The debrief continued for another 90 minutes. When it was finished and she stood to leave, Blake said, "Carter, hold a moment." Dorian and the other personnel filed out. Sullivan passed her on his way to the door and put a hand briefly on her shoulder, a touch so brief it might not have been intentional, but it was. She knew it was. She let it land, and then he was gone, and she was standing across the table from Nathan Blake. He said, "How are you?" Not a commander question, a different kind of question. She recognized the difference. "I'm functional," she said. "That's not what I asked." She thought about it honestly, which was what he was asking her to do. "I'm angry," she said, "at Preller, at the situation, and at myself for being exactly where Volkov needed me to be. You couldn't have known." "No, but I have a habit of expecting that if I prepare well enough, the variables will be manageable. Tonight showed me that a variable I didn't account for was already inside the wire. That's a different category of problem than win compensation." Blake said, "You didn't give him anything." "No." 6 hours. Volkov, full interrogation. You gave him nothing and you got yourself out. She looked at him. "I had reasons to hold." "Most people have reasons." He paused. The reasons don't always hold. She said mine did. Blake was quiet for a moment. He walked to the window that looked out over the compound and stood there with his hands in his pockets and said nothing for long enough that she wondered if the conversation was finished. Then he said, Preller processed 11 Iron Wolf mission packages in the past 3 months. We don't know how many of those were compromised. We're pulling every operation for audit. It's going to take weeks. He turned. During that time, Iron Wolf stands down from active operations. We run training. We assess. We rebuild. He paused. I want you to be part of that process, not as a student, as an instructor, running sniper integration scenarios for the team. She looked at him. You're asking me to stay. I'm asking you to run training evolutions for a team that needs to see what you can do in conditions it can actually observe and debrief afterward. The Valley doesn't do that. A training environment does. She thought about Volkov, about the unfinished quality of what had happened tonight. She said, and the separate conversation about Volkov is still separate and will happen when the timing is right and not before. Blake held her gaze. Can you work within that? She considered it honestly. Yes. Good. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Carter, what you did tonight, what you held through, what you chose on that ridge when I told you it was your call. He stopped. He was not a man who finished sentences like that one with words. He nodded once and went through the door. She stood alone in the operations room for a moment. She took the photograph from her pocket and unfolded it. Her father looked back at her from the image with the particular half expression he always wore in photographs, slightly unsatisfied with the moment of being photographed, entirely satisfied with everything that surrounded it. She had taken this picture on a November afternoon in Virginia. She had been 23. He had been 58 and healthy and entirely himself. She looked at him for 30 seconds. Then she folded the photograph and put it back. She went to find Hayes. He was in the equipment bay, which was where she had found him before the mission, and he was doing what he always seemed to do in that room, managing his equipment with focused attention as a way of managing whatever else was happening inside him. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her the way he had looked at her coming off the helicopter with the open, slightly undefended expression of a man who has updated his position and hasn't fully rebuilt the wall around it yet. She said, "You came back for me." He set down what he was holding. Blake authorized secondary recovery after JSOC confirmed you were alive and held in the corridor. It was an authorized operation. You pushed Blake to authorize it. Hayes didn't answer immediately. I said what I thought was the right call. I know. She paused. You didn't have to do that, given your position on my capability before this mission. He looked at her steadily. My position before this mission was that I didn't know your capability. I said so at the time. He stopped. I was also wrong about some of it. Not all of it. Some of it. What part were you wrong about? The part where I thought the numbers on paper were the question. He picked up what he'd set down and turned it in his hands, not using it, just holding it the way people hold things when they're working through something verbally. The question was whether you'd hold when it mattered, whether you'd make the call when the call was yours to make. He set it down again. You answered it. She said, for what it is worth, your position on my first rotation status was not unreasonable. The concern was valid. The conclusion was wrong, but the concern was not. He looked at her. Is that your way of saying we're square? It's my way of saying the conversation we're having now should have been possible before we went into the valley. It wasn't. That's on both of us. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. You know what the problem with you is? Several things, probably. You're right too often and you're calm when you're right, which makes it worse. He shook his head. Blake wants me on the training evolutions. He said you're running sniper integration. He just told me. You gonna make us all look bad? I'm gonna show you what the Overwatch position sees that the ground element doesn't. After that, what you do with the information is your business. Hayes looked at her for another moment. Then he held out his hand. She shook it. It was not a grand gesture. It was two people in an equipment bay at 4 a.m. after a night that had asked everything of both of them and received everything back in return. It was not the beginning of a friendship exactly. It was something more specific and more durable than that. It was the beginning of the kind of trust that only forms between people who have seen each other operate at the absolute edge of their capability and survived what they found there. She left the equipment bay and walked back through the compound to her bunk. She sat on the edge of it and began the gear maintenance ritual without deciding, to her hands moving through the sequence automatically while her mind processed the accumulated weight of the past 24 hours. At 0600, Sullivan knocked on the frame of the barracks door. He stood there for a moment without coming in. "Get some sleep," he said, trying. "I mean actually sleep, not sit there with your rifle and think." She looked at him. "Is that what I'm doing?" "That's what I was doing after my first bad rotation. Took me 3 days to figure out that the gear was going to be there when I woke up, and the thinking wasn't going to resolve anything at 0600, that it wasn't going to resolve at noon." He paused. "The rifle will keep." She set it down. Sullivan started to leave, then stopped. He said without turning around, the same way he had spoken to her before the mission at the mission board. "Volkov let you go. Don't think he didn't know the risk. He had other options, and he chose to hold you rather than eliminate you on the ridge. I've been thinking about why." She had been thinking about it too. He wanted information. He wanted information he could have tried to extract on that ridge with less risk to his operational security. He moved you instead. He brought you to a secondary location. Sullivan finally turned. He was doing what you were doing when you were running the escape scenario in your head. He was investing in a longer game. She looked at him. He expected to have me longer. Or he expected that whoever he sent to the east corridor would close off the recovery window. Something went wrong on his end. His coverage of the corridor failed, which is why JSOC got the signals read and why the recovery window opened. Sullivan looked at her directly. "You were not supposed to get out tonight. You got out because someone on his side made an error. I want you to know that because I think you're sitting there believing you beat him on skill and determination alone. And you did beat him on skill and determination, but you also caught a break." She took that in honestly. "Thank you for telling me. I tell my people what's true, even when it's uncomfortable." He paused. "You're my people now, Carter. Sleep." He left. She lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Sullivan had said. About the longer game. About Volkov choosing investment over elimination. About the error in his corridor coverage that had opened her window. She turned these things over in her mind with the same patient methodology she brought to firing solutions, looking for the angle that explained the geometry. And then, just at the edge of sleep, something came to her. Volkov had told her he had walked the North Ridge 3 days before the mission. 3 days. The mission had been classified and compartmentalized. Only 6 people above field level had access to the mission parameters. Preller had been one of them. But Preller's signals contact pattern had begun 3 weeks ago. Not 3 days. 3 weeks. If Volkov had been in position on that ridge 3 days ago, and Preller had first made contact 3 weeks ago, then Volkov had known about Iron Wolf's operational focus on the Al Rahim Valley for 3 weeks. Not just the specific mission. The operational area, the target set, the team, which meant the 3 weeks of signals contact had been used to plan not just one operation, but something larger. Something that used tonight's mission as a piece of a structure that was still being built. She sat back up. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about what Dorian had said. 6 people above field level held the mission parameters. But the operational area, the regional focus, the team designation, those parameters were held by a wider pool. Preller was the source for the mission-specific intelligence. But someone else possibly had been the source for the longer structural intelligence. Someone with a different access level and a different contact timeline. She got up and went back to the operations center. Blake was still there. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her disheveled and still in her mission kit with fresh bandaging on her wrist, and he did not tell her to go back to sleep. He said, "What did you find?" She told him. The silence that followed was not the silence of men processing betrayal. It was the silence of a man processing the possibility that what they had found tonight was not the end of the leak. It was the first layer of it. Blake picked up the phone. Blake was on the phone for 11 minutes. Claire sat across the table from him and did not move and did not speak, and listened to his side of a conversation that was being conducted in the careful, compressed language of people who understood that the words they were choosing would determine the shape of the next several hours. He said yes 3 times. He said understood twice. He said one phrase that she caught and held on to. We may have a second source. We need to run the access logs against the extended timeline. He put the phone down. He looked at her. Dorian is already on it, he said. The 3-week timeline is a significant discrepancy, and they missed it in the initial analysis because they were focused on mission-specific intelligence. You found it because you were thinking about Volkov's positioning on the ridge and working backward. He paused. That is good counterintelligence thinking for someone whose primary specialty is shooting people at extreme range. She said, if there's a second source, Preller's arrest didn't close the vulnerability. Volkov still has access to something. Possibly, we don't know what level yet. Dorian's team is running it now. Blake stood and walked to the window again. It was becoming a habit she associated with him processing things he hadn't finished thinking about. You should sleep. You said that already? It was true already. He turned. Carter, the analysis you just gave me is exactly right, and it will be worked by people who are specifically trained and resourced for this kind of investigation. You don't need to solve it tonight. I know. But you're going to sit here and think about it anyway. Probably. He looked at her with the expression of a man who recognizes himself in someone else and finds it more irritating than comforting. Then sit here and think about it. I'll have someone bring coffee. She slept at 0800 and woke at 1400 and felt the concussion as a dull, persistent weight behind her left eye that Carver had told her would last 3 to 5 days. She ate hydrated, reported to Carver for the morning monitoring check, and then went to the operations center to find out what 6 hours had produced. What 6 hours had produced was a name she did not know and a rank she did not expect. The second source was not a logistics officer. The second source was a signals intelligence analyst attached to the regional command at a level that gave her access not just to mission parameters, but to the full operational picture of Iron Wolf's activities in the theater for the preceding 3 months. Her name was Hargrove. She had been with the command for 8 months. She had been recruited the preliminary assessment suggested before she arrived, which meant she had been placed deliberately inside the command structure and had spent 8 months building access and credibility while feeding Volkov's network a steady stream of structural intelligence about Iron Wolf's operational patterns, target priorities, and team capabilities. Volkov had not been reacting to Iron Wolf. He had been studying them, building a model of how they operated. An extraction covenant had been the operation he had designed to test that model under live conditions with Claire as the variable he was most interested in understanding. Dorian delivered this assessment in the operations center at 1500 with Blake Sullivan and 2 additional JSOC personnel present. He was precise and unemotional about it, the way a person is when they are delivering information they have processed past the point of reaction. When he finished, Sullivan said, he used our own mission to study our team, specifically your sniper capability, Dorian said. The Overwatch doctrine, the contingency responses, the decision-making under capture conditions. Hargrove's reporting over the past 3 months included detailed analysis of Iron Wolf's sniper integration protocols. Volkov was building a model for how to defeat that capability in future operations. Claire said, he let me escape. The room went quiet in a specific way. Dorian looked at her. Explain. Sullivan told me last night that Volkov's corridor coverage failed. That's why the recovery window opened. But Volkov doesn't fail at things he plans for. She kept her voice level. He positioned his people on the North Ridge 3 days in advance. He designed the APC as a mechanism to draw me out. He planned the capture specifically. And then his corridor coverage failed. She paused. A man who plans at that level doesn't fail at corridor coverage. He withdrew it. Dorian was very still. He let me escape, she said again, because the escape was the last data point he needed. He wanted to know if I could get out. He wanted to know if I would hold under interrogation and then use what I had to escape rather than wait to be rescued. He was running an assessment. The entire operation from the ambush to the capture to the corridor was a live assessment of Iron Wolf's most capable asset in conditions he controlled. Blake said, if that's true, he has everything he needs to plan a second operation specifically designed around your capabilities and limitations. Yes. Which means, Sullivan said slowly, the next time Iron Wolf goes into the field with you on Overwatch, Volkov will have a model for exactly what you'll do and exactly how to counter it. Unless we change the model, Claire said. Dorian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Blake. Something passed between them in the silence, the kind of communication that happens between people who have worked together long enough that the language is mostly subtext. Blake said, "What are you proposing?" She had been thinking about it since she had connected the timeline in her bunk at 0600. She had been building it the way she built firing solutions, working backward from the target through the variables to the position that made the shot possible. Volkov has a model of how I operate. He believes that model is accurate because he gathered it under controlled conditions. He believes I don't know he has it. She paused. We let him keep believing that. And then we operate in a way that uses his model against him. Sullivan made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound of a man recognizing an idea he wishes he had thought of first. Dorian said, "That is a counterintelligence operation. That is not a sniper operation." "It's both," Claire said. "The trigger is still a rifle. The setup is counterintelligence." The room was quiet for 30 seconds. 30 seconds in a room full of people who think fast is a very long time. Blake said, "Dorian." Dorian looked at the table. He looked at the wall. He made the expression of a man performing a calculation that involves many variables he is not going to share in the current company. Then he said, "The operation would require JSOC authorization at a level above my current approval authority. It would require Iron Wolf to be rebuilt around a specific operational deception. And it would require," he looked at Claire, "the primary asset to operate with the understanding that Volkov will be expecting everything she does." "I know," she said. "He will plan for you specifically. Everything he observed about your capabilities and your decision-making will be built into his countermeasures." "I know that too. And you still want to do this?" She said, "He walked onto a ridge in the dark 3 days before my mission and stood in the exact spot I was going to stand. He built a trap around my training, my doctrine, and my instincts. He used a man inside our command structure to do it, and then he used me to do the rest." She kept her voice entirely level. "I want to finish the conversation." Dorian looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed his folder. "I'll make the call." What followed was not fast. It was weeks. The kind of weeks that feel like compression, like time behaving differently under pressure, where the days are long and full, and the larger shape of things moves slowly regardless of how fast any individual moment passes. Iron Wolf stood down from active operations, as Blake had said. They ran training evolutions. They rebuilt trust in the integrity of their communications. They conducted the audit of Preller's 11 compromised mission packages, a process that produced results that were sometimes simply administrative and sometimes stopped people mid-sentence and required a moment before anyone spoke again. Hargrove was arrested quietly and without announcement. Dorian handled it personally, which she found later was not his standard practice. She did not ask him why he had made that choice, and he did not offer to explain it. Claire ran the sniper integration training with Iron Wolf for 6 weeks. It was not what she had expected it to be. She had expected resistance, the residual friction of operators who still had not fully updated their assessment of her. What she found was something more interesting. The team that came to training evolutions was not the team she had met at the initial brief. Something had shifted in them, not because of her credentials or her rank or anything she had said, but because they had watched her work in the valley and survived partly because of what they had watched. That kind of shift does not require a conversation. It is simply there. Hayes was the most interesting evolution. He came to the first training session with the body language of someone who had decided to be a serious student, regardless of any previous position, which was itself a form of respect she recognized and appreciated. By the third session, he was the most engaged operator in the group, asking questions that were specific and genuinely curious. Not questions designed to test her, but questions designed to understand the things she was teaching. He wanted to know how she thought, how she built the firing solution in real time when conditions were changing, how she held the thread of the mission picture while managing the immediate demands of the shot. She taught him. She taught all of them. She taught them the things her father had taught her, translated into the language of team operations and combat conditions. And she taught them the things she had learned in the valley that no training manual had ever put into language that matched the reality. At the end of the fourth week, she demonstrated the 1,200-meter shot that she had been told to demonstrate if she needed to establish authority. She hadn't managed to establish any other way. She had not needed to establish authority any other way. She demonstrated it anyway because the shot was worth demonstrating. She put 3 rounds through a target at 1,220 meters in a 7-mile-per-hour crosswind in under 8 seconds. The third round was through the same hole as the second. No one said anything for a moment. Then Kowalski said, "That's not legal," in a tone that was the highest compliment available in his particular vocabulary. She put the rifle down. "That's what Overwatch looks like from the inside," she said. "Now let me show you what it looks like from yours." The JSOC authorization for the counterintelligence operation came through in week 7. Dorian delivered it in person, which was again not his standard practice, and again went unexplained. The operation had been named and resourced and given an execution timeline that depended on signals, intelligence indicating Volkov's network had resumed active planning after the disruption of his 2 sources. That signal came in week 8. He was operational again. He was planning something, and the early indicators from the signals assessment suggested the target set was familiar. He was coming back for Iron Wolf. Blake called the team together and delivered the operational concept with the same precise, unhurried clarity he brought to every brief. But there was something different in the room this time. The team was different. The weeks of training and the audit and the rebuilding had produced a unit that felt to Claire's assessment more cohesive than the one she had arrived at 2 months ago. Not because the trauma of the betrayal had bonded them exactly, but because working through it together, naming it, auditing it, and then choosing to move forward anyway, had produced something that trauma alone doesn't produce. It had produced a team that had decided consciously to trust again. That decision was different from trust that had never been broken. It was more deliberate, more durable. Sullivan listened to the brief with his arms crossed and his face carrying the expression she had come to recognize as his full engagement mode, a slight narrowing around the eyes and a stillness of the jaw that meant he was processing at depth. When Blake finished, Sullivan said, "Carter runs Overwatch." "Carter runs Overwatch," Blake confirmed. Hayes said, "Different position than last time." "Different position," Claire said. "Different approach, different timing. He has a model of what I do. We're going to show him something that fits the model perfectly right up until it doesn't." Hayes looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has revised their estimate of a person upward and is still in the process of discovering the ceiling. "And the part where it doesn't, that's the part you've been building for 8 weeks. That's the part I've been building for 8 weeks. The operation executed on a Thursday. The valley was different in the specific ways that valleys are different when you have been in them before and survived them and come back. Not safer, not less hostile. Just known in the way that things that have tried to kill you become known with a kind of intimacy that has no comfortable name." She took her position at the primary Overwatch point, the same ridge, the same outcropping, the same 1,100 meters. Exactly where Volkov's model said she would be. She settled into it with the complete comfort of a person who is doing something familiar, and she let that familiarity show in her movements, because she knew the drone that was her own side's drone was not the only surveillance in this valley tonight. Volkov's network had eyes on this approach. The signals intelligence said so. He knew Iron Wolf was here. He was watching. She let him watch. At 40 minutes into the mission, exactly when her pattern suggested she would shift to the secondary position to engage the APC-class vehicle that his model told him would draw her out, she did not move. The vehicle came. She heard it. She stayed still. On the team channel, Hayes said, "Vehicle is entering the approach. Sniper, what's your status?" "Hold," she said, a pause. "Sniper vehicle is 30 seconds from the choke point. Hold." She could feel the tension in the silence that followed as a physical thing. The team knew the plan. The team had trained for this moment for 8 weeks. But knowing the plan and holding still when the vehicle was moving toward your teammates was a different kind of test, the kind that training prepares you for but cannot fully replicate. She trusted them to hold. She had spent 8 weeks building the thing that made trusting them possible. The vehicle stopped on its own. It stopped because Sullivan and Kowalski, operating from a position that Volkov's model said would be empty because Iron Wolf's standard doctrine did not put ground. Assets in that sector had placed an anti-armor device at the choke point 40 minutes ago, while Claire was providing the visual distraction of occupying the primary overwatch position and behaving exactly as Volkov expected her to behave. Volkov's model was built around a doctrine that Iron Wolf no longer used. The vehicle stopped. The fighters who dismounted from it moved into the kill zone that Hayes and Reyes had established on the northern slope. The radio burst from the compound that was Volkov's signal to his secondary force to close the eastern quarter found no open channel because the communications disruption that Dorian's team had prepared cut his network at the moment the vehicle entered the choke point. It lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the valley was quiet in the way that valleys go quiet after violence. A specific and total silence that is different from the silence before. She lay in her position and she breathed and she listened to the team's radio check go around the channel. Sullivan, Hayes, Kowalski, Reyes, Blake, all present. And then Blake said, Iron Wolf Sniper, status. She said, Iron Wolf Sniper is secure, target is down, mission is complete. A pause. Then Hayes on the team channel in a voice that carried something she had never heard from him before tonight. Something uncomplicated and direct and entirely without reservation. That's our sniper. The debrief happened at FOB Viper in the same operations room where every debrief had happened, and it produced a result that was definitive in the specific way that Dorian's voice became definitive when he was delivering something final. Viktor Volkov had been killed in the choke point engagement. His network had been disrupted at 3 nodes simultaneously by assets coordinated with Iron Wolf's operation. The intelligence infrastructure that Hargrove and Preller had spent months building for him was dismantled. The operation was closed. Dorian said at the end of the debrief, the counterintelligence concept that made this operation possible originated with Lieutenant Carter's timeline analysis at 0600 on the morning after Extraction Covenant. He said it in the same tone he used for everything flat and precise, and then he closed his folder. It is in the record. Blake looked at her across the table. He said nothing. He didn't need to. 3 months later, in a ceremony that was quiet by design and attended only by Iron Wolf and the specific personnel who had been part of Extraction Covenant in its aftermath, Claire was awarded the Silver Star. The citation used language that was careful and precise and true, and it named what she had done without embellishment, which was the form of recognition she would have chosen herself if anyone had asked her. No one made a speech. Blake pinned the medal with the economic precision of a man who understood that the weight of a moment did not require amplification. Sullivan stood to her left. Hayes stood to her right. Kowalski and Reyes were behind her. After the ceremony, she walked to the far end of the compound, where a wall held the names of personnel who had not come back from missions in this theater. She stood in front of it for a long time, not reading the names exactly, though she read them, thinking about the people behind the names, about the particular thing that was lost when a skilled person dies doing a skilled thing, the accumulation of knowledge and judgment that dies with them and has to be rebuilt slowly and imperfectly by the people who come after. She thought about what Blake had told her, that her new battlefield was training the next generation. She had resisted it briefly in the way a person resists being moved from the place where the thing that matters most is happening. She understood now that she had been wrong about where that place was. The valley was where the mission happened, but the people who would go into the next valley were being made somewhere else in training evolutions and classroom decisions and the slow accumulation of capability and judgment that good instruction produced over time. Her father had known that. He had taught her that. She had simply needed to arrive at it herself. She took the photograph from her pocket and held it. She had come to FOB Viper as a lieutenant with a rifle and a record in a team full of men who were certain she was the wrong person for the job. She was leaving as something that had no clean rank designation, but that Sullivan, in the brief and exact way Sullivan communicated things that mattered to him, had called the person we build from now. She looked at her father's face. She thought about their garage in Virginia and the cold morning and the rifle between them, and his voice telling her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to stop when fear had already won. She thought about the ridge in the dark and the hands that had come out of nowhere, and the column in the ceramic fragment in the 2 kilometers she had run on a body that was voting against every step. She thought about Hayes' voice on the helicopter saying, "You're alive." She thought about Sullivan's hand on her shoulder. She thought about Blake saying your call and meaning it. She thought about the classroom she was going back to, The operators who would sit in front of her and doubt her in the particular way that people doubt the thing they cannot yet imagine themselves becoming. She thought about the first time she would demonstrate the shot and watch the room go quiet, and then watch the quiet become the beginning of something new. She folded the photograph. She put it back in her breast pocket over her heart where it had always been. She was not unafraid. She had never been unafraid. Fear had followed her through every moment of this, from the gate of FOB Viper to the ridge to the column to the 2-kilometer run to the valley she had just come out of. Fear had been present for all of it, and she had not stopped. Not once. Not for a single moment had she stopped, and that was the only answer that had ever mattered, the one her father had given her in a coal garage in Virginia before she was old enough to understand what it would cost her to live by it, and the one she had spent every day since proving she already knew. She turned away from the wall and walked back toward the compound, toward the work that was waiting, toward the operators who needed what she had learned, toward the next version of the mission that would always exist because the mission always existed. And she walked with the particular steadiness of a woman who had been tested at the absolute limit of everything she was and had not broken, and who understood now completely and without reservation that she never would. The work that was waiting did not announce itself. It rarely does. It is one of the quiet truths about the kind of life Claire Carter had chosen, that the most important thing she would ever do almost never arrived with the sound of helicopters or the weight of a rifle across her shoulders. They arrived as a clipboard, a roster, a classroom with a whiteboard that didn't quite erase clean, and a row of folding chairs that had been arranged and rearranged by so many hands over so many years that they no longer sat straight no matter how carefully you set them. This is where she went in after the wall of names. This is where she went after she folded her father's photograph and put it back over her heart and turned away from the dead toward the living. And if you've stayed with me this far, if you've followed Claire from the gate of FOB Viper through the ridge and the column and the 2-kilometer run in the dark, then you already understand that the next chapter of her story was never going to be quieter than the last one. It was only going to be different. The schoolhouse sat on a base in the high desert of the American Southwest, a sprawl of low buildings and longer ranges, where the wind came off the mesa with the same indifferent honesty it had come off the mountains in the Al Rahim Valley. Claire arrived the way she had arrived everywhere, with a duffel on each shoulder and a rifle case in her right hand, the latches scratched from rotations that were now a matter of record rather than rumor. There was no convoy this time. There was a staff sergeant with a sign-in sheet and a building number, and the kind of careful professional neutrality that people extend to a person whose reputation has arrived before them and who they have not yet decided how to feel about. She knew that neutrality. She had been on the receiving end of it her whole career. The difference now was that she understood finally and completely that it was not an insult. It was a question, and the only honest answer to it was the same answer it had always been. You watch me work. Specialist Dana Reese was the 7th name on the roster, and she was the only one who did not look up when Claire entered the classroom on the first morning. The others looked. 11 operators and operator candidates, men mostly, a couple of them senior enough to have heard the unredacted version of what had happened in eastern Afghanistan and to be sitting a little straighter because of it. They looked at her the way the motor pool had looked at her 2 years ago, which is to say they looked because they were trying to reconcile the person in front of them with the story they had been told, and the reconciliation was not coming easily. Reese looked at her notebook. She was small in the way that good snipers are often small, economical with her frame, nothing about her built for show. She had her materials laid out on the desk in front of her with a precision Claire recognized instantly because it was her own precision, the systematic arrangement of a person who had decided that order in the small things was the foundation of order in the large ones. Pen aligned with the edge of the notebook. Notebook squared to the desk. Range card already filled out for a problem that had not been assigned yet. Claire had read the files. She read every file the way her father had taught her that preparation was the only honest form of confidence. Reese's numbers were extraordinary, not good. Extraordinary in the specific way Claire's own numbers had been described to her once across a table by a commander named Blake, who had told her they were historically unusual. The girl could shoot. She could shoot the way some people can do mathematics. As if the answer existed before the work, and the work was only a formality her hands performed to arrive at something she already knew. What the file could not tell Claire, and what no file ever could, was the thing underneath the numbers. whether there was a person in there who understood what the numbers were for. She found out on the third day. The exercise was a whole problem. Claire had designed it herself, and she had designed it cruel. A simulated overwatch position, a notional team moving through a notional kill zone, and a target of opportunity that would present for exactly 4 seconds and then disappear behind cover for the remainder of the scenario. The trainees were instructed that the team's success depended on the overwatch element maintaining concealment until the precise moment the mission plan called for engagement, which was not when the target of opportunity appeared. It was 11 minutes later. Every instinct a shooter has screams at them to take the shot that is in front of them. The 4-second window is a gift, and refusing a gift feels like failure in the body before the mind can argue with it. The entire point of the exercise was to teach the thing that cannot be taught with words, which is that the discipline to not shoot is a harder discipline than the discipline to shoot, and that a sniper who does not understand the difference is a liability dressed up as an asset. Reese took the shot. She took it cleanly, beautifully, a perfect simulated round through a target that any board of instructors would have applauded in isolation. And in taking it, she revealed her position 11 minutes early to a notional enemy who in the scenario's logic immediately repositioned a notional force to collapse on the notional team, and the after-action computation came back with the kind of result that in the field would have ended with a wall and some names on it. Reese did not flinch when the result came up on the screen. The target was exposed, she said. It was a high-value target. The probability of a second opportunity was low. I made the engagement decision based on the available information. You did, Claire said. It was a good shot. It was a perfect shot. Claire let that sit for a moment. The other trainees were watching now, all of them, because they could feel that something was happening that was larger than a single exercise. It was the best shot anyone has fired in this evolution in the 18 months I have records for. And it got the entire team killed. Reese's jaw moved once. It was a small thing. Claire saw it because she had spent a career reading faces as tactical information, and because she had seen that exact movement before in a mirror in the years when she had been a girl who believed that if she was only good enough, only precise enough, only correct enough, the rest of it would take care of itself. With respect, Reese said, the scenario penalizes accuracy. No, Claire said. The scenario penalizes a person who thinks the shot is the job. She set down the controller. The shot is not the job specialist. The shot is the last 4 pounds of pressure on the easiest part of the whole thing. The job is everything that happens in the 11 minutes you decided you were too good to wait through. She did not break Reese in front of the others. That is not how you build anything, and Claire had learned slowly and against her own nature that building was the entire point now. She found her that evening at the long-range bay where Reese had gone after hours the way Claire herself used to go, after hours to put rounds down range in the dark, because the body's discomfort with the dark was a variable that had to be defeated through repetition like every other variable. Reese was prone behind her weapon alone, the range lights off working a problem in conditions that punished her for working it. Claire lowered herself onto the firing line a few feet away and said nothing for a while. She let the girl shoot. She watched the discipline of it, the patience in the breathing, the way the small body went still in the way that only certain people's bodies will ever go still. And she thought not for the first time that the saddest thing in her line of work was watching real talent stand right at the edge of the thing that would make it matter and refuse to take the last step because the last step required admitting you were not the most important element in the equation. My father taught me to shoot, Claire said into the dark. Reese did not stop working her problem, but Claire could tell she was listening because the rhythm of her breathing changed by a fraction. He wasn't a soldier. People always assume he was. He was a marksman, a precise man. He believed attention to detail wasn't a personality trait, it was a moral position. She watched the dark range. He told me once that a person who is careless with a rifle is careless with a life, and that carelessness with a life is the one sin you can't walk back. A pause on the firing line. Then Reese said without turning her head, he sounds like he'd have hated my whole problem result. No, Claire said. He'd have understood your whole problem result completely. He'd have seen exactly what you were. He saw exactly what I was, and what I was specialist was a person who thought being the best shot in the room was the same thing as being trustworthy. It is not. It is not even close. She let the wind move across the bay for a moment. Trust is the 11 minutes. Trust is the team moving toward the kill zone, believing you will not fire until the plan says fire. And you holding still while every nerve in your body votes against it because the people down there are betting their lives that your discipline is bigger than your talent. The shot is what you do. The hold is who you are. Reese was quiet for a long time. Then she said in a voice that had lost some of the armor it had been carrying, "How do you hold when everything is telling you to move?" And Claire understood that the question underneath the question was the only question that had ever mattered, the one her father had answered for her in a cold garage in Virginia before she was old enough to know what it would cost her to live by it. "You find the thing that's worth more to you than the shot," she said, "and you hold on to that instead." The call came in week 5. It came the way these things always came, through channels that did not explain themselves, a sudden tightening of the schedule, in a closed-door briefing, and the particular quality of silence that descends on a building when the people in it understand that the abstract has just become real. Claire had thought she was finished with the real. She had made her peace with the classroom and the range and the slow, unglamorous work of building people, and she had meant that peace, had felt it as true when she stood at the wall of names and turned toward the living. But the network Volkov had built did not die with Volkov. It had been dismantled. 3 nodes simultaneously in the operation that had ended him in the choke point. The intelligence infrastructure that 2 traitors had spent months constructing had been pulled apart and laid out and accounted for. But a network is not a man, and the dismantling of a structure is not the same as the removal of every person who knew how to rebuild it. One of them had surfaced. A financier and facilitator who had moved money and weapons for Volkov's operation, and who possessed in his head and in a set of encrypted records the names of every asset and source and access point the network had cultivated across the theater. He was being moved. There was a window. An Iron Wolf rebuilt and audited and made whole again over weeks that had felt like compression was being tasked to take him. They needed Overwatch. Blake flew out to the schoolhouse to ask her himself, which was not his standard practice. And Claire understood the moment she saw his stillness in the doorway of her classroom that he had not come to put her back on a rifle. "I'm not asking you to take the position," Blake said when the room had cleared. "We have the position covered." "Who?" Claire said. "That's why I came." He sat across from her in a folding chair that did not sit straight. "JSOC wants the schoolhouse's top candidate integrated into the element for this. It's a controlled environment relatively. Single high-value target, narrow window, strong intelligence picture. It's the kind of operation you put a new shooter on when you want to find out what they are before you find out the hard way." He paused. "The candidate the schoolhouse is putting forward is Reese." Claire said nothing for a moment. "You can pull her," Blake said. "Your call. I won't override it. You've spent 5 weeks with her. If you tell me she's not ready, that's the end of the conversation." And there it was, the same 3 words he had given her on a different ridge, in a different country, when the weight of an entire mission had been sitting on a single decision. Your call. He had meant them then. He meant them now. And Claire understood that he had not flown across a continent to ask her permission. He had flown across a continent because he knew that the hardest thing a teacher ever does is let the student go to the place where the teacher can no longer protect them. And he was the only person alive who could ask her to do it and have it mean what it needed to mean. "She holds," Claire said. "When it counts, she holds." "You're certain?" "No," Claire said. "I'm not certain. Nobody is ever certain. That's the whole thing." She looked at him. "But I know what she is, and what she is ready to find out." She was not on the rifle for the operation. She was in the operations center, in the chair Blake had occupied the night that had changed her, and she discovered something about that chair that no one had ever told her, which is that it is the hardest seat in the entire building. The shooter has the simplest job. The shooter has the wind and the distance and the geometry of interception. And as terrible as those things are, they are at least things, problems with solutions, variables that yield to discipline. The person in the chair has nothing to do with their hands. The person in the chair has only the radio and the map and the unbearable knowledge that everything they could do has already been done weeks ago, in a classroom in the dark of a range bay, in the slow accumulation of a thing that either holds now or doesn't. Reese took the primary overwatch position at 1,100 meters. Claire heard her settle into it over the channel, heard the breathing go still in that particular way, and she closed her eyes for 1 second in the operations center and saw the girl exactly prone behind the weapon, the small economical frame gone motionless in the dark. The target convoy entered the corridor on schedule. The team moved into position, and then the way it always goes, the picture changed. Contact, Hayes said on the channel. He was on this Operation 2 ground element, the same Hayes who had come off a helicopter skid in the dark and said, "You're alive." Squirter vehicle breaking from the convoy moving east. It's fast and it's not in the plan. A pause. "Overwatch," Blake said, calm as still water. "The principal is in the lead vehicle, not the squirter. Hold your position. Hold your angle on the principal." And Claire understood in the operations center, with her hands useless in her lap, exactly what was happening 1,100 meters away in the dark. Because the squirter vehicle was a target of opportunity. It was exposed, it was moving, it would present for a handful of seconds, and then it would be gone. And every instinct in a shooter's body screams to take the gift that is in front of you. It was the hold problem. It was the exact hold problem, built not by an instructor in a classroom, but by the indifferent machinery of a real night, with real lives in the balance, and Dana Reese was lying behind a rifle with the easiest part of the whole thing, 4 pounds of pressure, away from her finger, and the entire mission depending on her refusal to take it. Claire keyed the radio. She was not supposed to. The protocol was clean. The operations center did not clutter the channel during an engagement decision. But she keyed the radio, and across 1,100 meters, and through a network of relays, and across everything that separated the chair from the rifle, she said the only thing she had ever had to give. "Reese," her voice was level, "find the thing that's worth more than the shot, and hold on to that instead." The channel was silent. 1 second, 2, 3. Claire could feel the silence as a physical thing, the way she had felt every silence that had ever mattered. And she did not breathe through it because she was the one in the chair now, and the chair does not get to breathe. "Holding," Reese said. The squirter vehicle ran. It crossed the open ground and disappeared behind terrain and was gone. The gift refused, and the team held its formation, and the principal's vehicle rolled into the kill zone exactly as the plan had drawn. It 11 minutes of discipline distilled into the moment when the discipline finally got to become the shot. "Overwatch," Blake said. "Clear to engage." "Engaging," Reese said. The round was perfect. Of course, it was perfect. The round was never the question. The round was the easiest part of the whole thing, and it went where it was sent, and the principal who carried in his head the names of every asset Volkov's network had cultivated did not carry them anywhere ever again. It was over in a span of time that the radio measured in minutes and the human body measures in something else entirely. When the team's radio check went around the channel, every voice present, Claire sat in the chair with her hands in her lap and listened to it the way she had once listened to it from the other end, from the dirt, from the ridge, when it had been her name in the count, and her status that the channel had been waiting on. And then on the channel, in a voice she had heard before, in a context she would never forget, Corporal Raymond Hayes said the only thing that needed saying. "That's our sniper." Reese came back to the schoolhouse, a different person in the way that the valley makes people different. Not safer, not softer, just changed with a kind of intimacy with the work that has no comfortable name. She found Claire at the long-range bay in the dark a week after the operation, the way she had found her before, except this time she did not lie down to shoot. She lowered herself onto the firing line and sat, and she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I almost took it. The squirter." "I know," Claire said. "I had it. I had the angle and the wind and the lead. It was a good shot." She was looking out at the dark range. "And then you came on the radio, and I thought about the thing worth more than the shot, and the thing I thought about was the team moving toward the kill zone, believing I'd hold." She paused. "It wasn't even a hard decision after that. That's the part I can't explain. It should have been the hardest decision of my life, and it was the easiest one, because once I knew what I was holding on to, there was nothing to decide." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her left breast pocket over her heart where it had always been, and she took out the notebook, and from inside the cover she unfolded a photograph that she had never shown to anyone. She had not shown it to Sullivan or to Hayes or to Blake. She had carried it through the gate of FOB Viper, and the ridge, and the column, and the 2-kilometer run in the dark, and she had never once shown it to another living soul. She handed it to Reese. The girl took it carefully, the way you take something you understand to be load-bearing, and she looked at the face of a man on a November afternoon in Virginia, 58 years old and healthy, and entirely himself, slightly unsatisfied with the moment of being photographed, and entirely satisfied with everything that surrounded it. My father, Claire said. He taught me everything I taught you. He died 2 years before I entered the program. I never got to tell him whether it held. She looked at the photograph in the girl's hands. The thing he gave me, the thing worth more than the shot. I spent a long time thinking I was carrying it for me. The night you held that position, I finally understood I was carrying it so I could hand it to you. Reese looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she handed it back with both hands the way you return something that does not belong to you. What was it? She said. The thing he gave you, the actual thing. Claire folded the photograph and put it back over her heart. He told me courage was not the absence of fear, she said. He told me it was the refusal to stop when fear had already won. She stood and she looked out at the dark range where a new generation was learning to defeat the body's discomfort with the dark one round at a time, the way she had, the way her father had taught her to. I was afraid the whole time, specialist, the gate, the ridge, the column, the run, the valley, all of it. Fear was present for every second of it. People think the brave ones aren't afraid. They're the most afraid. They just decided a long time ago that there was something bigger than the fear, and then they held on to that instead. She turned. You held. That's the only answer that's ever mattered. It's the one he gave me before I was old enough to understand what it would cost. And now it's yours. She went home that winter, back to Virginia, to the house in the country, to the garage that still smelled the way garages smell of cold concrete and old oil, and the particular metallic stillness of a place where careful work was once done. The bolt action point 308 was still on the wall where her father had left it cleaned and oiled by her own hands every season since he had died, because a person who is careless with a rifle is careless with a life. And that was the one sin you could not walk back. She stood in the garage where she had been 11 years old, kneeling beside a patient and precise man who believed that attention to detail was a moral position, and she let herself feel the whole shape of it, the way the thing he had given her had moved through her and out of her and into another person, now who would carry it into another valley, who would hold another position in another dark, who would one day kneel beside someone 11 years old or 23 years old and hand it forward again. That was the part she had not understood standing at the wall of names. She had thought the loss was final. She had thought that when a skilled person died doing a skilled thing, the accumulation of their knowledge and judgment died with them and had to be rebuilt slowly and imperfectly by the people who came after. She had thought of it as a tragedy, a wall of names, a subtraction. But it was not a subtraction. It had never been a subtraction. Her father had died, and the thing he was had not died because he had given it to her in a cold garage before either of them knew what it was worth. And she had carried it across the world and through the worst night of her life and out the other side. And then she had handed it to a girl on a dark firing line who had held a position when everything in her body voted against it. The thing did not die. The thing was past. That was the entire point of every wall of names ever built, that the people behind the names had given what they were to someone, and that someone had given it to someone else, and the line ran forward unbroken into a future none of them would live to see. She took the photograph from her pocket one last time before she left the garage. She looked at her father's face, the half expression he always wore, slightly unsatisfied with the photograph and entirely satisfied with the life around it. It held, she told him, everything you gave me. It held, and I gave it to someone, and she held too. She was not unafraid. She had never been unafraid. And she'll give it to someone, and it'll keep holding long after both of us. That was the part I didn't understand. You didn't teach me to shoot. She smiled the way you smile at the dead, which is a smile with no audience and no performance in it, only truth. You taught me how to make sure the part of you worth keeping never has to stop. She folded the photograph. She put it back over her heart, where it had always been, where it would always be. Then she turned off the light in the garage and she walked out into the cold Virginia morning, toward the work that was waiting toward the next ones, who needed what she had been given, toward the long, unbroken line that ran forward out of a wall of names and a cold garage, and a girl on a dark firing line into a future that would always need exactly what her father had handed her, in the only language that had ever mattered, which had no words and was entirely understood. She walked with the particular steadiness of a woman who had been tested at the absolute limit of everything she was and had not broken, and who understood now completely and without reservation that the part of her worth keeping never would.